Welcome to Metanoia Mon Amour, a series of conversations that honor free thinking, created by Nicholas Gada Thompson, my human clone. Fernando, welcome. Hey Nico, how's it going? I'm doing great, really great. I'm really happy to have you here. We're all set. We are inaugurating the Chile edition of the podcast series Metanoia Mon Amour, which is a podcast, a series of conversations with the same name as the book that was we published last year. And we're kicking it off with my new old friend Fernando Véliz. As usual, no life rundown. If Fur's insights interest you, Google him before we discuss your topic. I focus on the guest's current passions. If you find what Fer has to share fun, interesting, challenging, or enriching, you can just Google him and do your research. Before we get into what you asked me to talk about, I'm not really interested in focusing on that kind of content or proposals. My interest is to focus on what the guest is currently passionate about. This goes beyond all of his resume, and eventually, at the end, I'm going to ask you a bit about what's coming up next, what your future horizons are. But here, I pulled a bit from my research on you, that you come from a communications background. Let's say that, yeah. Because we were following you, it's a conversation. And to kick things off, to warm up a bit, tell us a little about that part of you or that calling, where it came from, what it means that you're involved in the world of communication. And well, from there, as a starting point, we kick things off.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure, Nico. It's great to be able to chat, share perspectives, and create a dialogue that's always needed. Well, my connection to communication comes from my interest in building stories, creating narratives, perspectives, and viewpoints. And in a minute, I'll dive into communication from the audiovisual side. Really connected to the world, a film theory. He was really involved in that. And I was also really involved in the world of communication for the organizational field. So I started getting into formats from the audiovisual side, then moved into the world of magazines and tabloids. And at the end of the day, I realized that what I was really interested in was bringing ideas to life, establishing them and sparking conversations. From there, I got into the world of coaching, and little by little, I also ventured into writing books. So for me, communication is, I'd say, a meeting space, a dialectical space that often has tension, a space with textures, with gray areas, where conversation takes you to other places, creates an exchange, and in the end, that's sharing a symbolic space. And from there, of course, we need to ask questions and dive into the realm of curiosity.
You were telling me that you started or maybe had a chapter, and you might still be involved in the audiovisual side of films. Or, let's say you mentioned cinema. I'm interested because I knew you were an author, and then I'd like to ask you a bit about how we can do a ping-pong on the craft of writing. But you threw in the cinema part, and I'm curious about that too.
Look, I studied audiovisual, worked on documentaries, and in '91 I tried to create a TV show called I'm Talking to You, which was about the world of work brought to television. At 21, pitched a channel, lost sponsorship due to competition, studied journalism, moved into organized productions. We were competing with another channel's mess, so we didn't manage to get the sponsorship. So I came from an audiovisual background, and then I went on to study journalism, which got me into more organized productions. And in 1 minute, I was hired to do film campaigns. And I had to do the campaign for The Sentimental Joker, which is a film that had a lot of impact here. After that, we talked with director Christian Gallus and decided to create a film magazine called Diem, with a Latin American focus on independent cinema. Writers from Chile's intellectual scene contributed. The magazines were distributed in theaters featuring Latin American filmmakers. We also launched Mexican films. Our editorial line wasn't about ratings, but about integrating Chilean cinema into a Latin American context. We also advocated for a film law in Chile, one of the few countries without one. And it was a wild place, a delirious time. I'm talking about high print runs. And the magazines were given away in theaters with interviews featuring only Latin American filmmakers. We also launched films from Mexico. And everything, it was an absolutely creative and crazy period where our editorial line wasn't just about giving a movie 3 stars or saying I liked it or didn't like it. Instead, editors, sound designers, and directors wrote for us, and it was all about bringing Chilean cinema into a strong Latin American context from a place where everyone was committed. So during that time, we also pushed for the film law in Chile, which was one of the few countries that didn't have a film law. So it was a beautiful time. So during that time, we also pushed for the film law in Chile, which was one of the few countries that didn't have a film law. So it was a beautiful time. And of course, for me, that was the most creative, most disruptive time.
We're talking about you said 90 and you were 21. So the release of the movie, all that was in 2000.
But this program is called The Pulse of Work, and it was around 92.
Perfect. From there to the clear, because if I think about it, in Argentina it might be a bit more developed, but my creative formative decade didn't really kick in until around 2005 to 2015, let's say. Of course, before and after as well. But there is an elbow you enter because first there, by affinity, by search, by curiosity. Let's say you land in some place where others are also forming there. It's not like you just show up to a preformed group. You're part of the formation of an absolutely wild creative group.
You just mentioned intellectual, but I also picture bohemian, the mix of bohemia. We used to have our planning meetings at Liguria, which is a bar. In fact, I had meetings there with Enrique Sims from Cerdo Ypex. We did campaigns for Garach, Olimpo, Mondagrua, Argentine cinema. I was with Adolfo Aristarain in a bar with Maldives just hanging out and chatting about a place in the world. I interviewed him back then with a cassette, and I lost the cassette, and I could never publish it, I swear. So it was a very Latin American perspective. And then I met the people from the Yucamau group from Bolivia, and the director, what's his name? Hans, the visit, the play. So it was a world completely connected to creativity with a super regional Latin American perspective on cinema tied to our own life stories and the unique emotions of each country. So, if you ask me, it was a time when each issue was a monthly magazine. I was telling someone yesterday, and they didn't believe me, but the first print run was 100,000 copies, and it was on high-quality paper, thinking of it like an oven. So I'm talking about magazines that were given away at Hoyt theaters. So we had all of Chile covered, but the next month we dropped to 80,000 because that was too much. Then we scaled back a bit more, but the idea was how to bring quality cinema to everyone. So that was the goal. And that's why it was important to write from a very technical, yet specialized and reflective perspective. So, for example, here people wrote film directors, all the Chileans were writing, screenwriters. In 1 minute, there were some really big official media outlets that would say, hey, you guys aren't writing well in the magazine. It was called Bien. So what we did was cut out some photos, put different names on them, and change them all up. So it was a world, a creative time. And with Enrique Sims, we were drinking champagne and eating bread at 9 a.m. in Liguria. I'd say it was a time completely dedicated to building narratives and constructing identity. At Liguria, so I'd say it was a time completely dedicated to building narratives and constructing identity.
It's almost like an origin story for a Justice League. A good intellectual, hyper-creative, and maybe even a bit crazy Chilean version. Yeah, sure. Behind that wildness. And that really amuses me because In a way, sometimes even when you tell it, when you verbalize it, you realize that, or maybe another group comes along, some young kids in their 20s, and they say, hey, we want to make a documentary about that period. And saying, damn, in the end, well, we're a chapter in the history of Chilean culture, right? And if it failed or went completely off the rails, that's even more colorful for the story.
So, you know how it all fell apart?
Tell us.
We had a magazine that lasted 2.5 years. Every month was heroic, a team that was completely committed. And well, it was one, and what was that? It was national news. But there was an accountant who took all the money, and we went bankrupt. And then later, the magazine also went under. It was a huge deal because at the end of the day, it was terrible because all of us who were there were dedicated to the process. And then the magazine also went under. And it was a huge deal because at the end of the day, it was terrible because all of us who were there were dedicated to the process. And this guy, of course, made a profit. He took a big cut. And from that place, there was no project that could withstand it. And that was it. It just ended. But look, I'm left with the feeling that there's this scene with a pretty wild profile in how the whole process was created, and with the Chacatero Sentimental, which was a social phenomenon in Chile. It was a radio show that all of Chile listened to, and it was about stories of sex in Chile. So the experience was so powerful that, of course, we had a pass to get into all places to do whatever we wanted. And from there, creativity knew no bounds.
That's great. You remind me. I've never told this, at least not in public. I'll keep it short, and then we'll be talking about the topic you're interested in. Now we present it. But you remind me that they've also screwed us over, or we've screwed ourselves over. I mean, there's a culture of stealing and screwing people over in Argentina too. But this story is from India. I lived there for a year in 2016. I also got to know Burma and Thailand and all that, but the bulk of my time was spent in India, in remote places, with the intention, I think I mentioned it in some of the other podcasts, of documenting cultures that are on the verge of extinction. Besides that, I also worked on a couple of projects. I acted in a movie. I was the British hero. They call it the British hero. That's this, you are, but not because you're British, but because you're a foreigner. They also call the foreigner a foreigner more literally. And she has another chapter to tell. But I also worked at a festival as co-production chief at a festival called the India Surf Festival, which was a wonderful event that I founded and organized for the first 4 or 5 editions. Well, my friend Sebastian Millerino with this character, Saint Samantha, if I'm not mistaken about the last name, who's Indian, and the guy, and they had already been telling me Guadalupe Gonzalez. I joined the project. Seabass was with the Argentine crew. I stayed behind. I hired an Argentine friend who was in New Zealand. We brought him. From New Zealand to India, we worked for 2 months on pre-production. We put together a festival, 3,000 people a day, 500 people, camping, because the festival took place at the convergence of the Indian Ocean in the Bay of Bengal, a river whose name I can't remember, and the jungle, the wild dunes of Pori, in that region or area. And there were people camping. There were 30 countries represented. Out of the 500 camping, 200 were artists. And also athletes, because it was water sports, music, DJs, installations, a whole thing, day and night. 3 days. And we were pulling our eyelashes out, like we say in Argentina. And the guy took off. He literally sped away in the car, with the woman next to him, the little girl, 2000, and the employees kicking the car. He took off with the money. He didn't pay us.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
I summarized it, but let's say there's a backstory behind it. But hey, who can take away the dancing you've done? For me, that anecdotal money, the experience, the memories, and the friends I've made at that festival, whom I still keep in touch with, today is priceless. But hey, I've already built up too much suspense. I already knew, or I had, because I was reading you and such. I know you really like it, you have a passion for politics, but yesterday when we met at our mutual friend's house, Cote Fernandez, you told me, hold on, Nico, today or tomorrow, actually, on your podcast. I want to talk about work. And I put the title out there really broadly so you can ground us. From there, about the evolution of work, personal, work, professional, work. Go ahead. Say.
Well, look, of course, politics interests us all. It's 2000ian, but if you ask me what I've dedicated years and a lot of effort to, it's been the world of work. I always tell the story, the etymological origin to work comes from the Latin word tripaliarum, which means to torture. Tripaliarum, and what it means to torture. So the ones who worked were the slaves, the prisoners, and they had to work, carrying stones, carrying wood, and they suffered physically. Their bodies hurt from the work. And these days, people feel a pain in their soul because they work in places where there's no meaning, or where there's mistreatment, a bad atmosphere, and poor leadership. I worked in Latin America speaking at international seminars, and the ILO. Work in Latin America involves significant suffering, whose statistics show occupational diseases and mental health issues, indicating regional work problems. In Latin America, work culture issues are prevalent. WHO highlights work issues in the region. Focus on genuine, respectful organizations. So when one looks at the statistics, the WHO on occupational diseases, occupational mental illnesses, one realizes that in the region there is an issue with work and how to build organizations. At least I'm focused on that line, on how to build strong, flexible, adaptive, and conscious organizations where people are at the center, but not from that fake center. Where we play, where I respect you, no, it's about having that very democratic space, where we all behave with respect and dignity, and where a word that I think is key comes into play, which is meaning, where the meaning answers two questions. Why do I do what I do? And why do I do what I do? So, of course, I feel that the Tripaliarum 2000ian is still very strong in Latin America. When I do coaching for managers or work with teams from different countries, I always see the same thing, either bitterness or exhaustion or burnout and all these illnesses that come up over time, where in the end, there are numbers that solidify. For example, in Latin America, 85% of people don't quit a bad company. They quit a bad leader.
Good distinction.
Look, in Latin America, 93% of companies don't stick to their strategic planning. As you guys say, more verses, more poetry. It just doesn't happen. And the quality of Latin feedback doesn't exceed 25% effectiveness. So, I think there's something that needs intervention in the organizational field in general, both public and private. That's my passion.
Well, there you have it, the 2000ian premise, or the trigger. I liked that distinction about why it's looking back and for what it's looking forward. Also, in a way, you subtly but firmly hinted at the fact that you're a coach. I imagine you're an ontological coach from Newfield. From Newfield, which I also wanted to ask you about a bit, so we can give a shout out to the folks at Newfield, even though that's part of the story. Let's talk a little bit about Juan Vera. Mention whoever you want. Do you have any relationship? Carmen is coming in a little while. Do you have any relationship with body coaching as well? Or if you want, the question is, well, how? Okay, there you have the identification of the need and the opportunity. On your side to be useful, participate, and how you're applying it. Do you have any case studies to share with us without giving names?
Look, let's see. I'm 55, and by the time I was 40, I was already writing all the time. Well, I was working as a teacher and a consultant, but at 40, I wanted a change. I just didn't know which way to go. I joined Newfield and trained as an ontological coach. And from there was a shift, a huge shift, a massive one, where priorities changed, life changed. It changed my life. And from there on, of course, I connected with the world of the ontology of language. I got involved with Maturana, and years went by. Then I worked at Newfield. I was on the team, kind of like the head of communications they had. So, well, I had to create media outlets. We started a book publishing company where we published a book in July, and we began to, I would say, establish distinctions, set up viewpoints, build dialogue, the narrative, and I would say, create a learning community. And in 1 minute, well, I know Juan Vera. And to Juan has. Juan Vera, a big hug. Juan has a way of thinking that I absolutely love, and he has a beautiful way of writing. So, Juan, we would ask for text, and we publish the text. Years go by, a lot of years, and then we run into each other again. I buy the book, and more time passes. And recently, I wrote a book about a text called something like Opaque Chile on the topic of transparency. I published it in Mostrador, an online newspaper, and Juan and I picked up the dialogue again. And then Juan tells me, hey, let's do a written conversation. And so on. And we haven't been finding it. And I think what we have in common with Juan is a sense of responsibility from both sides to understand the organizational world, the political world, where, at the end of the day, there has to be something that leads us to a more virtuous place. I believe there's still a gap that needs to be filled in terms of relationships, encounters, common purpose, and articulating a change process that isn't just a drop in the bucket, that we're not just pretending to do something, but literally, you say there's something in me, Spitozendian, that I put on the table so that things can work differently.
Well, you're reminding me a bit of my chapter. After the creative, bohemian, intellectual delirium. I mean, I'm singing. I'm 46, so first of all, I thought I was much younger. You look 46, so I'm going to pass you my glasses. No, that's impressive. That's why now I understand what you were saying. I was 21 in the 90s. How can that be? Guys, I'm doing some bad math here. But well, also in a way, I just mentioned it. I went to India, and when I came back, I was coming back. Mainly as a producer, also a modeler, writer, photographer. I studied photography and worked for many years as a photographer, but when I returned from India, I came back with two main ideas, two strong concepts in my head. One was to make a transition, to see how, in what way to be attentive to the signs of the universe to transition from the world of art and culture, promoting the production of culture, fostering Argentine and international talent as much as I could. The trenches of sustainability, the triple impact of the more ecological issue, heavily influenced by the climate crisis. And well, my academic background, I studied biology. I completed half of the biology degree. I didn't finish it, but I came from there. And I can converge because it seemed to me that those were the trenches, that's where we had to gather the little soldiers in that trench, right? And the other, not a flag, but the other, is also not an epiphany. But let's say the other resolution I brought back from that trip was, well, hold on. You come from a world that's almost like a parasite. From the outside, you were like that until you were 40. In fact, I got my first bank account to travel to India. Can you imagine? I was 37 years old and didn't have a bank account. Outside the system, with a demonized view of market and private sector. Distrust towards public sector and politics, which are intertwined. That's why bohemia and art are refuges for skeptics, disenchanted with humanity. Back to empathy, creating connections with others, work-related or personal, where. That's why a bit of bohemia and art is the refuge for the skeptic. Not to say a total cynic, but pretty disenchanted with humanity. Like this. Well, back to this idea of empathy, this thing you just mentioned about being able to create a connection with others, whether it's work-related or personal, where CEOs merge or dissolve, however you want to see it, and you stop competing. Not that. Competition doesn't exist, especially among brands, but where collaboration is celebrated. So I started to chew on this idea of collaboration, this long-term perspective, the value placed on relationships with others, the inherent value that has, and then also the fruits that come from that value given to the bond. And then I thought, well, I have to go back to India. I need to catch up on civic education, political education. So I started to chew on this idea of collaboration, this long-term perspective, the value placed on relationships with others, the inherent value that it has, and then also the fruits that come from that value given to the bond. And so I said, well, I have to go back to India. I need to catch up on civic education, political education. I had no damn clue about politics. I wasn't interested. It seemed to me like the equivalent of studying the history of forgiveness. There's a science that studies mold. But let's say, at home it was kind of the same. Totally. Almost a rejection of that field. And when I came back, well, again, civic, political, economic, financial, all these dimensions of life, that I realized I was like a child in. And I'm still doing it. I'm still in that learning process. And the way I want to get back to you, I'm throwing the ball your way. The way I found it was also an opportunity with a distant uncle who became a mentor, someone I had worked for back in the day. And the guy, well, Francisco Indubil, I'll mention him. We call him Voy. He's like the father of the Fernandez family here in Chile. And the guy, founded with a partner and then became associated, a consulting firm that focuses on promoting communication, horizontal leadership, and collaborative and creative negotiation. He actually coined that concept of negotiating creatively. For what? To expand on basic concepts, right? To first grow the pie while taking care of the relationship. And then having a good relationship with the other party makes it way easier to share it, right? Does this whole zero-sum game and demonization come up to justify that feeling of you won? I beat the other person in the negotiation. Like you guys say, it's a mess, you know. You're already losing. And we come from the 20th century paradigm, the zero-sum paradigm in negotiations. And here, I hit on the trigger for all this, which is the fifth discipline by Peter Senge. You know, it might sound familiar, right? Yeah, Peter, it's like Freud with psychoanalysis. He admitted it wasn't finished. Many see it as gospel, but it's not fixed. Turn psychoanalysis upside down, add, evolve it, Lacan's approach. And Peter, systemic thinking applies to all organizations, public, private, NGOs, any group. The goal is to promote systemic thinking. The book, akin to the podcast, has 3 key concepts, metanoia, which I've covered in another chapter. Check other chapters, give likes, as we have YouTube channels. And sure, Peter, with the whole systemic thinking in organizations. In companies, but not just in private companies, in any kind of organization, public, private, NGOs, any group, clubs, whatever, any human gathering, the idea is to promote systemic thinking. And the book, going back a bit to the reference, like a relative of the podcast, there are 3 fundamental concepts, metanoia, which I've already described in another chapter, so I won't repeat myself. Just look for other chapters, and while you're at it, check them out, give them likes, and all that stuff that matters to us because we have channels on YouTube. Metanoia, integration from the subtitle, and systemic thinking are almost like the 3 pillars of the premise that I'm trying to establish throughout the reading. Metanoia, integration from the subtitle, and systemic thinking are like the 3 pillars of the premise I'm trying to establish throughout the reading.
I'm throwing the ball to you, let's say. You see Peter Senge, the systemic president, as part of the narrative. You see him, like I do, as a foundational piece. What other pillars come to mind?
We have time. I feel like I submitted something. Late, but I'm getting rid of the binary perspective. All right. And I swear to you, but you see the act here. And I think of it like a photograph. I think I had a great photograph where The teacher said the best black and white photography is when there is a range of powerful grays. And I believe in that. So, Peter Seki starts from something that is much bigger, where Umberto Maturana is, where philosophy connects with the marathon, the world of work, where the conversation becomes more complex. Asian manuals often don't relate to the Chilean or Latin American context. We get books from Manhattan or Spain. At a Latin American level, the challenge is creating a narrative with other theories. If relevant, mention Umberto Maturana, Rafael Echeverria, and Freddie Kaufman, who is Argentine. So I feel that maybe at a Latin American level, the point is how we articulate a narrative that also concludes with other theoretical systems. I mean, if your question, Sergio, is fine, it's fine to mention Umberto Maturana, Rafael Echeverria, and Freddie Kaufman, who is also Argentine, right? And I think there are a lot of people thinking about the organizational world. That's why I'm telling you, I'm not like those people who are just with a book. Sure. No, I don't think so. But I'm clear that the unit is integral, it's systemic, but it definitely has to go into the dimensions. For me, the world of work has axiology. Axiology studies ethics.
Okay.
It has ontology, which studies being, and it has notiology, which studies knowledge. So, if I have an organization with a transitional profile, for example, I don't have meritocracy. If I have an organization, that doesn't manage knowledge, because today we talk about the arching network. There's the hierarchy, which is the classic vertical structure, with the authority at the top and the organizational base. But the network here is an ideological network, where the concept, which is from my friend Cabrera, is that hierarchy is collective knowledge, collective intelligence. So I think at this point in the game, the fifth discipline is fine, but it's part of something much bigger. Well, literally, I'm telling you, I think today you can mix it with other dimensions of knowledge. When you talk about meaning, let me connect this for you. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I published a critique about Stoicism, a book. So yeah, it works. When I wrote my book Organizational Resilience, I got into the theory of resilience. I invented models, and it worked. When I wrote Communicating Living Organizations and other books. Now, putting one out is about communicative leadership, which are doctoral hypotheses. And basically, what I understand is that the ideal thing needed is to create knowledge. So, yes, holding on to an author is one thing. But if you don't ask me, I think today, theory comes from actions. It comes from practice. It comes from belief. It's more complex than you. So management has to be at the service. I had a meaningful life at work. So a lot of people are playing this funny game of thinking that people are robots and that I'm going to give them the strategic vision, the decision. It doesn't matter what the theory is if it's not behavioral. It's poetry, as you guys say.
Of course. It triggers my associations. No, the other way around, right. 2001, you talked about meritocracy. You talked about communicative leadership. I was just thinking, right. And also, the silence is right. We have to be, You start thinking, and you have to respect the thinking process. Right. You were talking about the idea of Redarchy. In contrast to monarchy, right. To the hierarchy, the hierarch. And of course, for me, again, I totally agree with you. Let's say there's nothing more mediocre, and I say this with love, the fan effect of a fanatic who grabs onto a rock star or even just a member of that music scene, and an author, and turns it into the Bible and all that. I think that makes sense for a teenager who's searching for identity. But then, let's say, curiosity, observation, humility, and a certain inner fire lead you to free thinking. I prefer to think about free thinking rather than critical thinking. Because for me, critical thinking is just part of thinking. It's one of the subsets of free thinking. And in that context, I mean, that framework. As a basis, we agree. I mentioned saying he's really like the trigger for a whole phenomenon, because he was. Exactly, not like the Bible, but rather the opposite, right? Like the first voice, let's say, of this new paradigm of exacto. In his book and with his author friends who came after, there are a lot of case studies, success stories, and failures to analyze. So, it gives you a bit of the practice behind all that. And of course, back then when hierarchy, the vertical structure, was so entrenched, so crystallized, in the culture and in the minds of people, both professionals and managers, but also employees and so on, it was like a necessary shake-up. I kind of relate to that, because I come from teamwork and I come from seeking consensus and I come from horizontal leadership. I mean, that is my DNA at some natural point, and after hearing it, I have come across methodologies and bibliographies and other perspectives, but that is the way it is. Now also, and here I throw it to you, as I summarize it to see, let's say, your reaction, a hierarchy where everyone has to have the freedom to think and express whatever they want, right? But doesn't that slow down decision-making a lot? I mean, what happens with the day-to-day, again, with the craft of leading, with the craft of managing a company, a public organization, whatever it may be? But doesn't that slow down decision-making a lot? So, what happens with the day-to-day, again, with the craft of leading, with the craft of managing a company, a public organization, whatever it may be? When you have, do you achieve after a cultural change, awareness, sensitization, etc.? You manage to get, okay, well, instead of just one person making a decision, let's all be involved, right? Other ghosts come up, like ego. Who had the idea? Who knows what? All this issue of opinion for the sake of opinion itself, opinion just to contradict, has to do with communication, with complex group conversation. I didn't mention it, and I'll wrap up with this comment/question. I trained as a consultant and as a facilitator for dialogue tables. So, also, as a student of certain methodological schools with specific designed protocols, there are ways to bring together groups of people who are either called because they are the right ones to tackle a challenge, or large groups, or they're caught up in an internal conflict that needs to be untangled. They call in facilitators. It's not easy. I would say that the most difficult thing is to allow a foreigner to get involved in this. That is very difficult. Then you have to identify the right people, those who need to be at that table and those who shouldn't. Get them to come, have them show up, without lawyers, without the press, you know. If you can manage that, I'd say you've already done about 60 to 70% of the work. Then there's communication, but when it comes to daily life, and then the assemblies, and this almost religious aspect of being horizontal, you don't feel it. I feel that. And it's very human because the pendulum and the inertia of movements, I feel like we've kind of lost something. We're losing a type of leadership that can be vertical, but was necessary or productive. That leadership has been distorted with shouting and demonization. But I also wonder, how do we integrate these two ways of looking at things? I feel like we've kind of lost something, like we're losing a type of leadership. That, sure, can be vertical, but it was also necessary or productive or had a certain meaning. In some respects, that leadership has been distorted with shouting and demonization. But I also wonder, perhaps, how do we integrate these two ways of looking at things?
I think they're different. I always say that to communicate, I mean, to inform is to give, and to communicate is to understand each other. Because I am seeing communicators who believe that it is a campaign, that it is a marketing gift for cultural transformation. And marketers think that your campaign is not about human understanding, it's something else. It's different. Of course, because if we're in the organizational field, if you ask me where the capital is for communication to flow in, create a cross-dialogue. In culture. And culture is made up of belief systems, rituals, myths, and milestones that shape behavior. If there's coherence, of course the hierarchy will flow, because the capital is culture. Now, what you're telling me, for example, comes from the concept of social dialogue. Social dialogue, when it happens in communities affected by armed conflict, like in Colombia, is the dialogue between the state, civil society, and the business community. And of course, there's tension. Already, 2001. So, they're different scenarios. But there's something I have in common, which I read, for example, from the organizational world, that the wounds are controlled because the others come with pain. For example, Colombia must have around 1 million dead and 7 million displaced people. So the pain is so intense that it makes holding a social dialogue really tough. In my upcoming book, which is about communication, I interview an expert. So the question is, how do you hold up the conflict when there's so much pain on the table, and maybe I have my killer right in front of me? How do I articulate the conversation? So we're talking about the framework. From there, credibility is needed to withstand the adverse, complex, and dynamic moments, and of course, from that point, see how to articulate the encounter with the other. But it's an extreme scenario. But in the business world, for example, let me tell you about my graduate research. I worked with 9 countries, 18 cases, and when it comes to cultural transformation processes, at the end of the day, I can tell you that maybe about 10% were successful. The rest was just empty statements, pure euphoria, but they couldn't sustain the transformation process. So, why? Because the capital of an organization is ultimately its belief, it's its identity. What dimension is my identity important for? There's identity, which is who I am as an organization. Then there's image, how I'm perceived. And finally, there's reputation, which is how my behavior holds up over time. In general, companies are so influenced by advertising agencies that they think everything is about image. But if you ask me where the capital of an organization is, it's in its identity. If I know who I am, if I understand why I think the way I think, why I act the way I act, and why I can grasp the emotions of my work group, from there I can carry out bitter transformational processes. So, the cultural change processes that Chilean or Latin American companies go through usually don't hold up because the leaders don't know how to carry them out either. So there are issues with leadership. It's always said that cultural transformation crises are carried out by the leaders themselves because they don't take the leap. Here, I tell you again that I don't have it. So, in the end, where am I going? I believe that the identity in the workplace, how we see ourselves, how we relate to each other, definitely creates complexity when it comes to building a culture. For example, the issue of hierarchy. Here is a company that says, no, we want to be Redarchy. And I tell them, watch out, it's not just a statement, it has to be cultural.
And I have a case. Here is a case for sure. If you are not here, I want to be. I was trying to be diplomatic and it was difficult for me. I even realized that I went off on a tangent, but Yusin jumped out of the box. Right, of course, but let's say it with love, always with love. Because if not, it feels like a criticism. We're all in this together. We're all learning or relearning or redefining how to do things. So it can't just be a matter of let's all go along with it.
So, to create a cultural transformation process, you need critical mass. And that critical mass has to support the process, but it has to come from belief. Exactly. So, generally, why don't change processes get articulated? It's because they don't last over time. And why? Because in the end, no one really sets the example behaviorally. So aim what I say. So what I often see with leaders is that they don't uphold the values they set, and people are constantly comparing. They're always looking for coherence and consistency. I see that leaders don't uphold the values they set, and people are constantly comparing. They're always looking for coherence and consistency. So, in the end, I've seen a lot of leaders who have A spectacular pitch, an amazing story, but when the spotlight's on them, they collapse. So 2021, the culture. Look, there's a writer who started a company called Leisman, check out, Jorge Calvo online. And this guy created such a powerful brand that it's now all over Latin America. And he said, my capital isn't in my company, my capital is in the culture. And he declared himself as a guardian of the culture. So, how do we get everyone to think and share common values, and from there have collective behavior that also serves a purpose? One case, there is a steel company in Chile, because it operates from Brazil to the entire world. And the case is the following. A company rebuilt as a consultant, but first meetings in the giant warehouses and all mural. When the meetings with human resources started, I had just launched a book on resilience and a model to take care of people. 20 people would come to the meeting and stand in front of the doctor and watch. So I would say to the manager, hey, isn't 20 a bit much? I mean, he told me, no, they're listening to what interests them, and they want to learn, and then they'll talk among themselves. So, well, that repeated itself. It kept repeating. The earthquake hit in 2010, and everything collapsed. An organization with a large organizational base, no middle management, and a core group of leaders who were 5 people. The leaders are in Europe, the workers call in the consultants, they put them on a soccer field, everything, and the workers themselves start making decisions. What does that mean? A collective knowledge was created that we call collective intelligence. The guys were empowered by a lot of training and had a strong desire for power. And they were making decisions. And knowing that the leaders are off in their own world, they had to take charge. So those are smart organizations. So the network of arching, complex and fragile works because it provides flexibility, cultural plasticity. The wave comes, and I move faster. Knowledge plays a role, needing to be free and sustained. And from there, the wave comes, and I can move faster in less time. That's why knowledge plays a role, but for that, it needs to be free and sustained. So instead of talking about work teams, we should be talking about entrepreneurial communities. Right.
You described integrating the hierarchical drive. 5 guys in Europe created conditions for employees to empower themselves. In an office with high ceilings and low walls, meetings were held with colleagues, and others could attend behind a low wall. Because those 5 guys in Europe, what they smartly managed to do was create the conditions, not to empower, but to create the conditions for the employees to empower themselves. Sometimes I understood you correctly. In an office setting with high ceilings and low walls, you had your meeting with your 3 or 4 colleagues, and there were people who had access to attend those meetings behind that wall. That was about 1.20 meters, maybe even less. How interesting, how interesting. I hadn't imagined that, at least to be able to support each other. This is such an interesting concept, and look at how they directly relate it to the office topology, to the architecture of the place.
Do you know what the difference is? Back in the Industrial Revolution, steam machines needed a lot of strength and muscle to turn, a giant lever. These days, all of that is automated. These days, it's no longer about muscle. Today, organizations run on knowledge. Knowledge flows from conversational and dialogical practice. It's the conversation that articulates knowledge, that empowers, that builds trust, and trust through actions. So the belief system works like an organization that knows how to have a dialogue, and obviously supports differences, and all that. But for that, and as Maturana would say, the issue is no longer competitive, but rather collaborative. But that's culture. That's a belief that goes into practice. And it's not that I'm saying this from a place of fanaticism, but I really believe in it. So the question is, how do I get you to believe all this content and bring it into your daily practice?
I love it. I want to read you a quote from the book. That can kind of serve as a closing for this chapter about work, and we can talk about the craft of writing, or maybe it sparks something for you, like an impulse. Let's say. I'll throw it out there, we'll share it with you, and let the reaction be natural. The quote is from John Mohawk, or Mohawk is probably an Iroquois surname, or from one of those Lakota tribes, or some of these Amerindian tribes from the north. The book is a fantastic book. The original title in Spanish is Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future by Melissa Nelson, a white woman who compiled a bunch of lectures mostly. And John Mohawk says the following, sure, it's Iroquois, at least, from the first sentence of the quote. It says that the Iroquois culture has the tradition that every time we gather for a meeting, we open with what's called a Gano. It's already the opening speech, Ganoia. There are 3 Ganoia. Some people call it a speech of gratitude. By the way, does that talk ring a bell for you? It's something that everyone who's sane in the world should agree to have. He says the TIFF is something like Iroquois diplomacy. We start with what we agree on, and then we move on to the things we can't agree on. He says we can't agree on things first. But of course, man, and yet we don't do that. In conflict resolution, meetings, that chapter is there, but it's not at the beginning. In fact, probably the next book or a book I need to write is about comparing methodologies with ancestral methodologies from everywhere and the ones we have now, because, again, let's say nobody invented gunpowder, we're constantly reinventing it. I close the quote. He says those things are really essential for us. And that's the rational mind, with a poetic way of expressing itself. Some people look at that and say it's spiritual. Whatever you want to call it, that's fine. We do this speech at the beginning and end of every meeting because people need to be reminded of it. Like the little bag from American Beauty, you know. The little bag that dances. Yeah, great movie. Nothing. I saved it from here, he says. For the meeting with Fernando. This was for you.
Let's see. I believe, considering the global context and all our developing countries, both internally and externally, with our neighbors, that the issue of coming together, creating a space for dialogue, validating the other, accepting differences, and holding on to that. I think that's the urgency. I think it's in a complex context, where you invade the other person, playing like you don't see them, just stepping over them. So we're on that. And I think that the day when you see and hear, you hear a lot of hopelessness in a day. So it stays with me, and that's why I also try to write, to set the day of the table, because I believe we need to move this. I don't know where to. I don't think there's a method for anything. I don't seek that. And even though you see it with the academic, rational world and everything, it seems like I deny that too. 2001. Yes. I think this issue sometimes. I mean, we need to create spaces for coming together from the most unusual places. I'm writing a book where I'm putting together 150 or 160 stories of conversations.
Look how cool.
For example, and I tell a story with this. I don't know if you noticed, but once I was out on the street after a few drinks. I was about 16 or 17 years old, in downtown Santiago, and I ran into a guy. At that time, I had been having issues with my dad. I was really young back then. And the guy had a problem with his son, and he was just as drunk as I was. And we started talking, and I was talking to him like he was my dad, and he was talking to me like I was his son. That's great. Psychodrama. It's called psychodrama. Absolutely. It's pure realism, and with catharsis throughout the whole story. And then we ended up giving each other a hug, and I never saw him again. I went home, Vivianito, and then where do I go? I think finding the other person, holding their attention, and maybe accepting the other in that place where you say it's impossible. I think that has value. And sometimes what I feel. And that's why when I write a lot about what I do. I'm very critical because I feel like there's a lack of a calling for power. I'm going for something. I'm not just playing around. I really want to make an impact in Chilean politics, or maybe in the organizational world, or in communication processes. I want people to see my books and communicate that it's a book that's so wild, because it's with images, with photos, and I take pictures and I joke that in 1 minute I put a CEO inside a coffin. I went to a funeral home, took a picture of a friend, and there he is inside the coffin. And I put one on a little balloon, and he starts to think about why he was such a bad leader. And from dark humor. So I insist, I don't think there's a method for how to kick the table over. But I believe it takes a bit of courage for different things to happen in the work world, in the political world, in the social world, in everything. Watch out, I'm talking about everything. And for that, it takes passion, conviction, and courage.
If not, why not? It's all good, fair. I think this is a great way to wrap up our episode. It's been a pleasure, an honor to have you. We've covered a bit of everything in this work. I think we all leave with some ideas. Well, anyway, it was really good. Thank you very much. I appreciate the space. Please, let's stick to tradition since we gently move the microphone. We give each other a little hug in the middle, and that's how we always wrap up the trucks. This was Metanoia Mon Amour, the era of integration. To learn more about this cycle and find out what's coming up, subscribe and hit that notification bell hard. Hello, cheers, and good luck.